Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us in this series of By the Fireside Conversations with Intriguing Authors. I've had an opportunity to visit with a number of good friends over the past several years in regards to books and projects that they have been working on that I find particularly of interest because it deals with something that's both historical as well as an initiative or project or insight that, again, intrigues me. And I am really excited to have Robert Sakowitz join me. Robert, thank you for taking time. I know it's been a busy schedule. I want to jump in because we've got a lot to cover in a short amount of time. I'm sharing, Robert, your just a piece of your biography, which still continues to be written. And for that, we are all lucky. The roles in projects and boards, both civic and corporate, that you've been on really are also illustrative of the commitment that you've made, your family has made over the years, not just to Houston, not just to Texas, but nationally. So I want to, folks can read faster than I can talk, but I want to truly thank you, Robert, for all of what you and your family have done for Galveston, for Texas, and for the nation. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. You mentioned Galveston. That's where my father was born and my great-grandfather came to. But I've been inhabiting Houston ever since I was born at St. Joseph's Hospital in Houston. And people, although I've been all over the place, people have said, well, why do you live in Houston? And I said, well, sit down and take a deep breath and give me about 3 hours and I'll tell you why. But it's
We're
because
going to do it. We're going to do it in less than 3 hours, but something that you and I, had a chance to talk about to kind of get us started
Sure.
is my family is here in Houston because of your family and the history of our two families coming from Eastern Europe as immigrants, and fortunately having a great network upon arrival into Galveston and then coming up to Houston. I referred to it, Robert. I'm not sure if I shared this with you, but when our son got bar mitzvah, I created a video called "The Thread," which is how thin the thread has been over several lifetimes, but only made stronger by the work of your great grandfather and grandfather bringing my great grandfather to America, Galveston, and then to Houston. So thank you for that as well.
It's a wonderful story you related to me, and I was not aware of it, and I'm delighted to hear of it.
Well, and I will share one other part because I decided to take this collection of different, photographs over the years. Um, People who are from Houston, Robert, will know of Sakowitz.
Sure.
Some people outside of Houston will know about it because of its, retail posture and retail role. I think that this is a national story, and I think it's a national exemplary of, um, you know, starting from a small footprint in Galveston and Houston and growing it out, but also, the history of not just retail and the economy, which really gets me, Robert, to what we want to cover in a short amount of time.
Sure.
History of our families, all being what we can relay and share, uh, you know, offline. But I sense after talking with you and observing you that this book has been in your brain for 30 years, in that it finally is in print. So why now? What's the origins of the book? I think you shared that there are some, and we're going to ask you to share a couple of excerpts from the book, but why now?
Sure.
What's the origins of the book?
Well, the origin of the book is quite simple. basically, ever since I was in high school and in college, I've always taken pretty extensive notes. And in classes, I found that if I could write down a lot of what the professors said and let them know what they said, giving it back to them, I'd make half decent grades. So I wrote a lot of things, a lot of notes, and continued that through college. I took extensive notes during my business career for the same reason, because it stands you in good stead on trying to remember basically what you've seen, what you've heard, and even what you've done and your impressions about it. And so I've had a lot of those notes uh, in books or notebooks or documents that I've kept over time, just keeping them, not necessarily knowing, but thinking I would write a book.
Right.
Why now? Because maybe I don't know. It goes back a very long, to decades. People have said you have had when we're talking, and I'm relating some stories. They would say, "Gosh, you've had such an interesting life. Have you written a book? You ought to write a book. You need to write a book.
Right.
Have you written a book yet?" And over and over. And so that seed being planted and having the documentation, which I had kept, not only my notes, but other memorabilia, uh, it made for the possibilities of a book. And also back to talking about school, literally at St. John's in Houston, where I graduated high school or prep school, whatever you want to call it. Um, One of the books that was sort of keystone to a professor named Grobleski, Professor Grobleski's English class. There were, I had two heroes. One was John Steinbeck, and the other was Ernest Hemingway. And the book that we studied specifically, other than his novels or treatises, was a very thick book called The Collected Short Stories of Ernest Hemingway. And they were little vignettes. They were, with the exception of the play The Fifth Column, which was 88 pages, the others were from literally 1 to 40 pages. And the book, called More Than a Store, that I have written here, is more, the complete title is More Than a Store, 3 Decades of Tumultuous Changes, 1960 to 1990. And it's my mature years retail career, post college, until the stores were closed by $8 oil and the flash crash on Wall Street. And that's a whole nother story, but basically that's the end of the book. It encompasses that 30 years in the form of vignettes from 3 to 30 pages, and only 6 or so are between 17 and 30 pages. The other 49 or so, because it's 55 vignettes, are between 3 and 14 pages. So it's an easy 3 or 4 chapter read and then go to bed. 4 more and then go to bed.
Right.
So that's the origins and the form of the book.
So in your foreword, or in your introduction of the book, you describe what you just said. And
Yes.
but I think you also kind of addressed that, and we'll get into these 3, 60, the time frame, the 30 years, the tumultuous years. But I think you described this as it is a set of vignettes in retail, in the world that you were operating in the
Well,
family business.
if I can interject before you go further on that, although you probably want to finish your thought.
No.
But
I'd love for you to
yeah,
read from
yeah,
that introduction.
sure. But it isn't just the retail world is the point.
Right. Right.
Um, it is the experiences through the eyes of someone who was doing that. But
Yes.
basically, uh, um, I tried to outline the 30-year period that caused a seismic cultural shift worldwide. And starting in 1960, and so I will read, as you said from the introduction, the youth rebellion, as many boomers will recall, was about a new American way of life, of opening up minds with and without drugs to new experiences that challenge the status quo of the post World War II era. The ongoing Cold War to contain the global expansionism of communism, the space race between Russia and America, all wrought constant political challenges in our country and throughout society as well. An exploding youth population demanded social changes with the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and its opposition activists, the creation of the international oil cartel OPEC, and the rampant inflation in the economy. All were exacerbated by the vast expansion of technology usage in communication and transportation. During the first of those decades, our Sakowitz stores launched the nascent um, ready to wear of some of the greatest European couture designers, introducing the first in store complete designer boutiques in America in Houston, Texas. And it was a Europeanization of American retailing. So it goes into launching during the miniskirt era. Andre Courrèges, who was the darling of Jackie Kennedy, um, along with Oleg Cassini, who's the American designer. But Courrèges was the sweetheart. Courrèges was the first person who was the member of the Chambre syndicale de la couture in France to start his own ready to wear. Now, seems like it's too esoteric. This was a seismic shift because in France, which was, of course, still recognized in even 1950s and 60s as being the fashion capital of the world as far as people were concerned who had any interest in the fashion industry, they would look to Paris. And the couture designers had to be, by designation, members of the Chambre syndicale de la couture and very specific delineations. They had to have very specific qualifications to become members. And none of them, but none of them made what is called ready to wear. It was all custom designs. You would go
Right.
in there and you'd have your body fit and you would have it designed by Dior or Chanel or any of those people. Courrèges was the first member of the Chambre syndicale to actually say, no, I'm going to make it in-house. This was unheard of.
Right.
And I flew over there and have outlined in the book how I launched that, giving him the American design bodies. And I give a little explanation, more than a little, of how apparel is made, how it is actually manufactured, the whole history of the design, and what makes for the ability to market it and to be able to distribute it. Because department stores were more than just a physical, more than a store.
Right.
They were not only distributive intermediaries for the manufacturer, designer, and the ultimate consumer, they also were in the role of editors, of entertainers, and educators. And that's the role that Sakowitz undertook. Now, others just bought and sold merchandise, perhaps. We
Right.
didn't believe in
Right.
it. We believed that an educated public, much as George Washington said about the American public, we believed that an educated consumer would know the difference, if you educated them, between quality and the lack thereof. What makes for something being expensive? What makes for something being desired because of its make? And so
Let me
we,
let, let me let,
go
let me
ahead.
play off of that. Let me because you're hitting on so kind of multiple cylinders that really
Yeah.
intrigue me, right?
Yes.
And that's that's the brilliance of talking with you about this. All right. One is that it was experiential.
Yes,
You came to Sakowitz for an experience. I remember as a little kid, my grandfather, my father, I remember coming to the men's store and it was an experience. You walked into the store, but it also wasn't like you said, hey, it's over on the rack, go pick it up. It was the introduction of quality, but you didn't have to fly to Europe. You didn't have to fly to Paris to
exactly.
have that. You brought that form of a global brand and a specialty store, if I can describe it that way, into alignment, Robert.
Yes,
Am I saying that
they
correctly?
were specialty stores. That's correct. And Richard, when you say when you walked in, it reminds me the minute you walked into that store that you see on the screen that is the cover of the book, our downtown white marble store.
Right,
Uh, that store, when you walked in the Main Street entrance, you would be almost attacked in a very soft way by an atmosphere because we actually sprayed perfume in the air. We were one of the first ones to ever do that.
right,
As you walked in the store, you didn't notice it, of course, but there was a fragrance that was being sprayed into the air so that it was an appealing feeling the minute and sensory event the moment you walked in. And that was supposed to, it was extremely intentional, obviously, to try and pique your curiosity about the sensitivities. Because one of the things to jump forward even now,
right,
and then we can backpedal, but through our catalogs and then now online, there are three things that customers, female consumers cannot achieve online. And that's a sense of touch,
right,
of yeah, meaning the texture, the fit, um, and the color. All three of those by any kind of form of pixelation yet, and maybe AI will get it, but not until now, not so far. You cannot transmit exact texture, exact color, and exact fit. That's the reason why you go to a UPS or a FedEx store today and you'll see a line of women sending back boxes because they're ordering three sizes in
right,
order to get one that fits and send the other two back. And it's really breaking the back of an awful lot of these distributors. That's why they have to really mark up their gross margin because it costs a lot. And they are achieving almost 30% returns. Neiman's, Saks, Mace,
right.
everybody. And so there are certain things that stores had that people who did not grow up with them as you did don't know, so they don't miss it because they didn't have it. But the people who did have it come up to me all the time and say, "Boy, do I miss Sakowitz."
Yeah, but you know what? You're raising, look, you're raising again, and we'll go back to kind of the uh, three decades of this evolution.
Right,
And I'll use this as a leaping off point. But oh, we're going to have these computers and these digital readers. We don't need bookstores anymore.
right.
I I can tell you, I go into bookstores now and they're jam packed, and it's every
Yes,
generation because people still want to touch something, right?
right.
Robert, when you think about the '60s, which was a very, very interesting shift in this country, both politically, economically, all of those shifts. What, how did that show up in the store? How did that show up from both a fashion perspective, but just from the overarching retail world? What came to a mind?
When I came back from, well, first of all, after I graduated from college, my father and I had a discussion. Even when I was in college, my junior year, my junior senior summer, I was going to go to work, and this is just a little family story that's not in the book, but I was uh, thinking about what I was going to do for the summer. And my father had said, there's a summer internship at Bloomingdale's in New York, and I'd like for you to sign up for it. Well, as a junior in college, and at that age, in the late teens, like 18, 19 years old, you get to that point having especially grown up with everybody sort of patting me on the head and saying, "Oh, you're going to go in your family business, aren't you? You're going to do this. You're going to." I mean, it's already predestined, preordained, only son, obviously. Back then, daughters were supposed to go to college and get an MRS degree, not go to work. So my sister Lynn, although she was interested at one point in some fashion design as an art, she never thought about the store per se as working in the store as a career sort of thing. But it was just a given, and I had started marking shirts at the age of 9 in the receiving and marking room with my grandfather's behest, saying it's time for you to go to work. So I'd go to camp for 1 month, and I'd do work at the store for 2 months. But we were driving up to my family's ranch, talking about this Bloomingdale's thing. And I said, darn it, what if I don't want to go in the business? And, mom was driving the car. Dad was in the right on the passenger side. I was in the back, sort of leaning forward, listening and chatting with him. And there was a sort of a silence. And my father says, well, that's your privilege. But if you don't want to go in the business, you let me know as soon as possible, because I'm not going to keep killing myself, knocking myself out to save this business for you to come into. We'll just sell the damn thing, and you can have some money and go do what you want to do, and you won't have to worry about it. And it just rocked me. I mean, what?
Yes. Yes.
You're going to do that? Needless to say, I signed up and worked at Bloomingdale's that summer
In New York.
in New York, yes, in
Yes.
their training program. And then after graduation from college, went to work as a trainee at Galeries Lafayette department store in Paris. Well, that really
What year?
1960.
Give me the year.
1960. This is
Okay.
June of
Yeah.
1960. And that was when things were just beginning to really evolve and change with this youthquake, that when I then came back and went to work at Macy's on an executive training program, it was all of the stuff that was young. So I worked at in the junior department. And when I finally came back to Sakowitz, because I got to jump ahead, otherwise we'll be forever, the whole feeling of our store was that I said, Dad, Mr. Bernard, we called each other by Mr.
Yes.
Tobe, my grandfather. Mr. Simon was my great uncle. Mr. Bernard and Mr. Robert, because if you said Mr. Sakowitz, 4 people would turn around. So I would always address him as Mr. Bernard in the store. And I said, every day that passes, a hearse goes by with one of our customers,
Right.
because we're aged, we're older, and the youthquake that's going on, and Carnaby Street in London, which has spread all over the world, ultimately with the Beatles and all the rest of that. That was a youthquake that totally changed. It was the youth that had grown up as the kids of the baby, those are the baby boomers. They
Right.
had grown up as the kids of World War II, very conservative families. And now they wanted to rock that. They wanted to change that completely, because, that's not our world anymore. Well, gee, does that sound similar to today? You get the same thing. Generations of, by definition, are between 18 and 30 years.
But
And
you had 2 things happening, Robert, parallel. You had Jackie Kennedy bringing phenomenal amount of art and culture.
the youngest president,
Yes.
Richard, we had for a long time. I mean,
Right.
period. And
Right.
so that was exemplary of the youthquake. You're exactly right. Nail on the head.
And then, but then the other part of it seems to be, so you go to Europe, you go to New York, you go to Europe, and you come back, and you're recognizing that there is still a generation that will always go to Sackwitz because that's their store. The question is how is this next new generation, emerging generation, going to look at Sackwitz as
Correct.
their store, right?
Correct.
So does
Correct.
that mean
Not
bell bottoms? Tell
right.
me, tell me, I mean,
Yeah.
what started selling? What started
Many
sticking?
skirts. Well, I was after my agreement with Mr. Bernard was that I would come back um, only, and this is for a personal reason with my sister and her husband at the time, her first husband. Um, I would only come back if there was a specific job at a specific salary, sink or swim, and not reporting to anybody in the family, reporting to somebody else within the operation, the store operation. And
Right,
and that's what happened. I came back because there was a junior department. It was called the Young Houstonian, and
right,
in a way, it was a perfect sort of training ground because it was the store within a store. And
right,
I had done my internship at Macy's in their junior department and then Missy Petites and other things. But
right,
the junior department was dresses, coats, suits, sportswear, accessories, everything
right,
of a junior size, meaning juniors were three things. They were the sizes 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, as opposed to 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, which were Missy sizes and women's size configurations. It was also a spirit and a certain look. And
right,
so that junior fit in perfectly with what was the youthquake. And uh, not very long after I had been back, Mr. Bernard had his first heart attack,
right.
and
Yep, yep.
my father's he was 58 and I was 26 by that time. Um, I'd been in the role of buyer and then merchandise manager of a department or two, and um, as he's coming out of the ER and he's got tubes in his mouth and tubes up his nose. He's ashen gray, and I'm holding his hand, and he looks at me and he says, "I'm going to feed you with a fire hose because I want you to make as many mistakes as possible while I'm still alive to try and help." And
Right,
literally within less than a year, I was executive vice president, general merchandise manager, and sales promotion director of the whole operation, sink or swim, just like he had said.
right,
And so he said, all I want you to do is to come pencil out everything you're thinking about of changes. So I learned after literally the first time that I'd brought him something and had to pencil it out, always
right,
to pencil it out first.
right.
And we went from there, and I'd come up with these outlandish things, but they like launching all these products and the wine
Let me,
department,
yeah,
all that stuff.
hold on there. Let me go back to something, and then, uh, if you've got an excerpt from this kind of transition in the '60s that you want to reference, that'd be great. But let me feed back to you
Sure.
what I'm hearing. All right. My sense was that before you took the reins of the youth side, okay, that it pretty much was just a mini me of your mom and dad, just a mini me,
Yeah.
and not reflective of what was really the emerging culture, the emerging, like you said, mini skirts, pants, whatever it was. All right.
Yeah. But
So here you are representing both an internal change within the store, but to some degree, you were essentially telling Houstonians, especially moms and dads, but everybody, look, there is this movement and we need to be a part of it, or we're
right.
not only as a store going to be left behind, but to some degree, we could just end up being a cowtown community.
And let me key off of that. That's absolutely correct. But let
Right,
me key off of that and say that um, there was one other ingredient which is not readily apparent, but it was at the same time. We opened that white marble store that you're looking at in 1951. And in 1955, only 4 years later, Neiman Marcus bought a store called Ben Wolfman's Fashion. Now, why did they buy a store to come to Houston? Because back then, stores had exclusivities. They were not only, as I said, editors, entertainers, educators, but they were the distributors, the intermediaries for the manufacturer to the last mile, the retail, the customer.
Right.
Well, Sakowitz had started in 1902 as a gentleman's haberdashery, and when it came to Houston, that was in Galveston. When it came to Houston in 1910, it was still a little haberdashery. The Great Storm of 1915 in Galveston was worse than 1900, but because they'd built the seawall, not as many people perished.
Right.
So it was a terrible storm with destruction of merchandise and everything else. And so my grandfather said, that's it. Galveston's not going to come back. Houston has opened the Houston Ship Channel. The oil is going through Houston. All of the agriculture, timber is going through. Houston's the city of the future. We're going to move up to Houston, not
Shamrock
Galveston.
Hilton gets built. Shamrock Hilton gets built.
Well,
right?
not in 1910.
No, I'm sorry.
No, that's 1950.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother
Sorry.
story. That's in the 50s.
Yes.
So,
Okay.
so in 1910, they move up, and in 1915, they expand. They're still in the men's and boys business. Now, we're known for men's and boys exclusivities. We have Hickey
Right.
Freeman, we have Louis Roth, we have all these, but we didn't have the women's division until it was a leased department until we opened this store that you're looking at in 1951. We took over the women's departments, but we couldn't get those exclusivities that Neiman's had of the top apparel, women's apparel from New York. We got some from California because Mr. Bernard went out and got Helen Rose, who was a film designer, Jean-Louis, who was a film designer, from Hollywood. But we couldn't get those top names. Neiman's bought the fashion because the fashion had those women's names. They had those exclusivities. So they bought that store in order to enter Houston with their same exclusivities and continue to lock us out. When I came to the store, and Neiman's had opened in 55, I come to the store in 61, 62 from Macy's. We didn't have the labels. And so I looked at how do we become competitive with Neiman's in the high fashion, which is the keystone that brings in the moderate fashion. In other words, you got the high fashion. I looked at the strategy in New York, having learned from Macy's that there's an old expression that was coined by Bernard Gimbel, which was, does Macy's tell Gimbels? Meaning, they're very competitive with each other. That was clear. What wasn't known is that when he said that and started that little phrase, Gimbel's was a third the size of Neiman, of Macy's. Well, I tore a page from that book and said, okay, we're a lot smaller than Neiman's, but there's got to be a way to do this. I used that youthquake starting in 1964 with our Britannic Festival, launching, Mary Quant and Tuffin and Foale and Zandra Rhodes and all these London newbie designers to come to the States. And we were first in America doing that. And I used that as my linchpin, as my tool.
And the Beatles came to Houston, what, in 65?
65, 66. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So now let's go to the net. So we got the 60s. Good glimpse of the 60s. There, you come in having seen the world, seen where fashion, where brands, where culture all of this is moving. Now we come into the 70s, which was more than a tumultuous period of time,
Yes.
right? Right. We're coming on the heels of the Vietnam War, OPEC, the oil crisis, all of these things. And the world seems to be somewhat like, putting a wrench in the, however you want to describe it, on the throat of Houston on lots of ways. What happens to Sakowitz? What happens to retail generally in the 70s?
Well, a number of things. Houston really started booming because the oil embargo of 73 sent the price of oil sky high. And Houston, being the oil capital of the US, at least by only then,
Right.
um, really benefited substantially. So much so that people were moving here. There's a lot of competition. Some of our exclusivities um, said, we need more distribution in Houston because it's bigger. We had, and this is an example, we had in our men's department a men's furnishings line of button-down shirts, you will recall,
Yes.
under the brand name of Gant, Gant.
Right.
And Gant was the Oxford cloth, cotton, button-down preppy shirt that everybody wanted. And we were doing extremely well with it. They came to us and said, "Nah, Houston's growing too fast. We got to have more distribution because it's really growing. So we're going to sell it to somebody else too." I said, "What?" And they said, "Yeah, I mean, come on, we're buying more every year." They said, "Well, we're going to sell it to some more distribution." I said, "Who are you going to sell it to?" And they said, "Foley's." I said, "It's right across the street from our downtown store. You're kidding me." He said, "No, no, no, that's we have to do this. They have more stores than just downtown." I said, "I know that." Um, by that time, we had downtown, Post Oak, um, downtown Gulfgate, Post Oak, and we opened Town and Country Village in 1967. So we had those four stores plus the Shamrock Shop, men's shop.
Right.
And in 74, we opened in Arizona, but I'll get to that later. The point is, we were really, blowing and going. And with this problem with Gant, um, I said, we need our own private label. And that might be the solution. Let's try that. But in America, it was too hard to find a manufacturer who would do it under a private label. They wanted their own label. So, as is a chapter in the book, I happened to be in New York during the collections for women's sportswear. I was in New York almost every week because of all the different departments when they were in market in New York. And there was a women's sportswear firm called Evan Picone. Well, Evan Picone, there were two Evans brothers. One is Charles, and he ran the company, and his brother Robert um, didn't go into the business, went to California. Long story short, ended up being president of Paramount Studios. Bobby
Right.
Evans was the Robert Evans of Paramount Studios.
Right.
The famous film, the guy stays in the film or something like that. It was a great
Right.
movie. Anyhow, I saw him in New York and asked him how things are going and talk business. And he said, one of the interesting things is the international market. We're doing very well, but then there are places like India where Indira Gandhi, the prime minister, won't let us repatriate the dollars. And I've got $7.7 million, which is at least 77 million today, if not 100,
Right.
but in those dollars, sitting there. And I'm supposed to spend them over there to make movies over there, and they won't let me bring any money back. So I said, well, I'm thinking about trying to do some private label in Asia. Um, there's not much there, but there's some manufacturers. They have wonderful cottons in India, and I'm going over there. And I said, early in America, we had American history. We had something called the triangular trade routes. Why don't we
Right.
do a triangular trade deal? I'll buy from, I'll have them manufacture the shirts. You pay them in rupees, and I'll pay you in dollars over here and reimburse you. Well, I found an Indian manufacturer, again, a chapter in the book of all of the problems we had to go through to get that squared away for them understanding American make and American fit and everything else.
Right.
But that worked successfully for a couple of years, and then the Gandhi government found out about it and
Right.
had to stop it. But meanwhile, we had some Sakowitz red coach room button-down shirts that were extremely profitable and successful, and that started my trips to Hong Kong and then to Shanghai. I was in China literally less than a year, 10 months after
Oh,
Nixon and Kissinger. Uh,
right.
First American there. Needless to say, there were very, very few, much less on business. There were some tourists, but not a lot on business. I was there looking for products to buy for our gift department as well as manufacture stuff. So I got to the point where we would then be looking at merchandise, women's apparel that sold extremely well, that was French couture. I mean, French prêt-à-porter, ready to wear from the couturier.
Right.
So we'd buy X amount. And if something's a design, a particular dress sold extremely well, I'd keep one of them and take that one and go to Como, Italy, and buy um, fabrics, silk fabrics from the fabric designers. I was one of the very few retailers there.
Right.
Um, buy the fabrics and ship them to China, to Hong Kong.
Right.
Started a joint venture with someone in Hong Kong, and we would make that dress at a fifth of the price, bring it back under our own private label, and have a double mark on to protect us from markdowns. And that started what today almost has become the supply chain, international, global merchandising that you see today with Zara and with all of the
Right.
designers. No
So
longer
let
are
me
we
connect.
watching the
Yeah.
runway.
Let me connect the dots then, right?
Yeah,
So 60s comes and goes.
right.
We begin the NASA experience here, by the way, right? With this,
Absolutely.
moonshot, we're going to
That's
go to
with the
the moon,
60s. Yeah, that's
right?
with the 60s. And
Right.
Courage.
Right.
Courage launched the couture futur. It was the couture of the future. That's precisely
Right.
what he called it.
Okay. So then the 70s hit. All right. And I think the 70s, as you said, really created the internationalization of Houston. One,
Right.
because of the oil
Correct.
and gas part. Two, the Texas Medical Center is beginning to grow here,
Right.
right?
Right.
It begins to
And
introduce itself to, but I'm gonna play off of something. Hopefully, this doesn't sound like it's a unusual turn, but the 70s also began to open up a lot of philanthropy in this town, and which meant that there were emerging in the late 70s, early 80s, because it'll kind of connect the decades here. Houston began to do a lot more philanthropy. We had international people are doing well. There's a lot of growing wealth, but there also were a growing, emerging philanthropic, which also signaled to me, Robert, that both men and women needed different types of fashion to go to these events. It wasn't just putting, black tie and boots on. All right. And then
yes,
the third part of it is what you just said, and that is markets began to open up internationally in ways where so you really, Robert, were one of the pioneers of
very,
connecting
very
these dots.
earliest. Oh yeah.
Right.
I mean, seriously, none of the stores, uh, or if any, very, very few stores, were doing this whole three-way um, taking the bestsellers, making the designing the fabric, taking the fabric to China and making it under your own private label. That was not being done. The closest thing that finally happened on something like that in the late 70s or mid 70s was the Limited, where at the same time, remember that in the 70s, you're seeing this massive expansion to the suburbs.
Right.
60s and 70s. It started after the World War II, but really expanded immensely in the 60s and 70s. And so in the mall stores, where you have all these malls being built, um, just to give you an example and hold on to the thought of the malls and the Limited, when I would go over and I would try and have things made, it was always in the Far East. It was quantity. So when you'd say how much for that sweater, and especially in knitted goods, this happens to be true. They'd say, how many? And you'd say, well, I'm looking for, 120 pieces divided into small, medium, large, extra large, and they'd give me a price. And I learned very quickly to say, what's the break point? Well, 500 dozen or 100 dozen first,
Right.
and then another break point at 500 dozen. Well, if you divide 100 dozen, that's 12 times 100 dozen, 100, that's 1200. You divide SMLXL, so that's 36912, so that's 300.
Right.
And you do it in 3 colorways, that's 100. If you have 50 or 100 stores, as Les Wexner then opened for the Limited,
Right. Right.
it's not a big risk because you are spreading it out and you're not overpowering your inventory. I couldn't do that with 6 stores, but that's what helped create that whole series of small shop chains like the Limited, who was the first to do that in the malls. And what made that possible, of course, was the mall.
Right. But
Because
okay, so now,
DeBartolo, Smell
right,
Sign, and that's all in the 70s, right?
right. Okay, so now we got the box retailer, right? Volume, volume, volume. And as you may or may not know, my, Elner's family, started in the in the menswear in the, late
No,
1800s, early
yeah,
1900s in
yeah,
Tennessee, selling to the coal miners and all, right? And
sure.
as my father-in-law, God rest his soul, would say is, I don't know how the mom and pop specialty can survive the box retailer. So the box retailer comes
Well,
along.
wait, whoa, whoa, whoa. Let me stop you for a second just to clarify. You're talking about big box retail because remember, every store is nothing but a box, and a
Right.
department store is a box. But the department store, as opposed to a specialty store, which you mentioned before, is that
Correct.
a department store is all things to all people. It has what's called white goods. It has
Right. Right.
appliances. A specialty store only has fashion.
Yeah.
So you're talking about big box retailing, which was basically Grand Union, it was Kmart, it was those guys. That's what you're talking
Right.
about.
I'm
Right.
talking about that, but
Yeah.
also
I just want to
yeah,
clarify because
yeah,
there were categories,
right,
there from the National Retail Merchants Association board point of view, which I was on for 25 years,
right.
there were these categories of specialty stores, department stores, box stores,
Right.
off-price discount store, the different categories all the way down the line.
So as the 1980s come into fruition, and now you've got, massive suburban growth. We have, homes, you could buy a home, build a home, at some pretty phenomenal, economics back then. But you also had Reagan come in, and it was all about USA, all about USA, right?
Yes.
What began to shift? Because we'll talk about digital shopping and all of that. I know we're gonna. I want to go a little bit, few more minutes, if you would, and because I think we're really getting into some cool parts of this and some takeaways. But Robert, so the 80s come along, and you've got, growth in the suburbs. You've got, USA, you've got what are the trends that are beginning to change for retail at that point?
The trends that are beginning to happen um, were as I said, they're expanding into these malls.
Uh-huh.
There are different parts of the country that are doing better than others. Houston is booming in the early 80s.
Right.
And everybody is quite concerned because of inflation higher than double digit, almost 20%, which
Right.
is outrageous. People don't believe that that actually happened. Um, and so there was a discordance, so to speak, uh, geographically. And remember, one of the things that is extremely important in the history of fashion in America and fashion generally is there's a I was quoted in from a speech that I made to the National Retail Merchants Association annual convention. The New York Times quoted me and called it geographic determinism. That I was talking about how geography makes for a difference
Right.
in what sells and what doesn't sell. And in a chapter in the book, it's entitled A Brief Primer on Ready to Wear History and Fit. I sort of outlined a lot of that way before there were uh, these unknowns of today who generate audiences of thousands using the internet and the social media to become paid influencers of would-be savvy collecting followers. Um, you know, that prior to that, everything had to do with geography because of climate,
Right.
because of um, economy in local regions.
Right.
And that has a huge difference. What happened in the mid 80s is that OPEC fell apart
Yep.
and oil went from um, $49.75 to $8 a barrel. That's an 84% drop, if case you know, we'll do the math.
Right. Right.
Um, that became an incredible hit to our entire Texas economy.
Yep.
And I was sitting as chairman of the Houston branch of the Federal Reserve in 85. I was on the board 83, 84, 85 and seeing all these changes and was invited up to Washington as you get invited as a Fed chair of a local area. And was sitting with Paul Volcker after his morning presentation. And I said, Mr. Chairman, um, this was at lunch. We need an energy policy. We're getting killed in Texas. And
Uh-huh.
he said, Robert, I understand that completely. There are 10 states that have been terribly uh, negatively impacted, was the phrase, by
Uh-huh.
this current pricing of oil and gas. However, Texas is the worst among them, but there are 10 such states.
Huh. Right.
There are also 10 states that have been extremely positively impacted by this lower price of oil and gas.
Right.
And there are 30 states that have been marginally positively impacted.
Right.
Now, do the math and let's turn around and go up the hill and see if we can get you the hill, meaning Capitol Hill, and see if we can get you an energy policy. And I said, I think I'm going to slit my wrist. That was 1985.
Right.
And 2 months later, oil hit $8 a barrel. Our customers couldn't pay their bills. So they didn't buy anything.
Right.
Um, three of the five banks in our consortium were underwater.
Right.
So we had to file and reorganize and found an Australian partner, which is outlined in the book. But
Right.
but that's what happened. The 80s, the that's the third part of my book. The 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. Um, the shattering 60s, the tumultuous. I mean, the 1980s are called the chaotic conclusion
Right.
because it was
Right.
true chaos up and down. First part of the 80s was fabulous. The last part of the 80s was disastrous.
Right.
So when you talk about what happened in the 80s, It depended on what part of the country.
Right. Right. So Robert, I know we're going to run out of time, but I want to kind of go through a quick series, of questions. But let me put a capstone to, the 80s moving into the 90s,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Um, whether it was the savings and loans, the banking, the real estate, oil and gas, we recognize that there are economies across the country and somewhat around the world, true, that have ridden the wave, but somehow have managed to still be standing. All right. Houston is one of those. All right. Up and down, around, twisted through. Um, Now, if you were to take a look at retail as it is today, which is, as you mentioned, online, AI, all of these different interesting factors. What hasn't changed, even with all of the innovations in technology, in
Well,
your
one
mind?
of the
What
things,
hasn't changed?
one of the things that I referred to before has not changed is that um, those factors that are technology that you mentioned um, do not satisfy fit, touch, meaning fabric,
Right,
and color. So people will get those online or they will get those from their influencer and they'll
right,
say, this isn't the red I thought it was or the yellow or whatever. And so they'll be very unhappy and they'll send them back. But um, that's almost priced into uh, things these days. And there is no such thing as a store setting fashion direction. There's no designer setting fashion direction. One of the chapters in the book is called And Then One Day It Went Away. It's one of the largest chapters in the book. And it's
right.
my experience of having launched Yves Saint Laurent's Rive Gauche in the United States. Was one of the first to carry him, and we had him exclusively because of my launching it. Um, and Ultimately, it goes through the entire years of how that helped build our reputation because after Courrèges and Saint Laurent, other people looked at us and instead of Neiman Marcus, they said, well, there's somebody else in Texas to look at besides Neiman's. So Valentino, we got.
Right.
Missoni, we got. Issey Miyake. I launched Zegna Menswear. I mean, all of these things played off one another and another and another. Ultimately, which was my strategy.
Right.
And lo and behold, it worked, until oil said it didn't work. We
Right.
thought we were in the fashion business, but we weren't. In 1985, we realized we were in the oil and gas industry, as was 84%, no, well,
Right.
82% of the businesses in Houston. So today, there's no real fashion director direction. I mean, even Vogue, Condé Nast Corporation,
Right.
Harper's Bazaar, they're having a hard time with being the arbiters because they aren't anymore. Stuff
Correct.
that's being shown on the runway, it's just
Right.
it doesn't make. So there are people designing things and a multiplicity of manufacturers, and they're doing it on their own. It's
Well,
independent.
yeah, but you have to take a look at, and this is where I'll bring some of this to home. First off, to your point, all right, Vogue does a runway on a Hollywood set last week.
That's right. That's the way that they feel as though they can do something. That's
Right.
correct.
So that
Can,
so
can,
now it's gone from New York, the Met.
can you put this on hold a second or not? No.
I can't. I can't.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah. Give me.
Linda, I'll
Give me.
call you right
Yeah.
back. Go ahead. Sorry.
So,
You can cut that. Yeah.
all right. So, like you said, there's the arbiters are different. There's influencers. There's all these different pieces that are changing about us.
Right.
All right, quick fire. Quick round. All right.
Yeah. Sure.
What were one or two lessons that you learned from taking this book that had been on your notes and in your brain in writing a book? Because writing a book is not an easy task. So what are one or two lessons you learned from writing the book?
Well, interesting. I'll do maybe a few more than one or two. Um, History, which is what this is of 3 decades,
Right.
is the aggregate of past events and circumstances, people. Heritage is something that's passed down through generations that can be physical or spiritual or intellectual. And culture, on the third hand, if there be a third hand, is the customs and rituals and habits that characterize a society. So, although history connotes the past, culture is very much in the present and is calling upon heritage in the past. So the book includes all three of those. And our history shows us that our heritage is to take chances and to boldly innovate and take the hit when it doesn't work and go on from there. Um, when presented with boundaries, change the map. Sometimes borrow from others and improve on what they've done. So, becoming the most diverse city in America, we've come to welcome what we can learn and take from other cultures, but we need to remember to study the mindsets that made them work where they were is different from how ours is from theirs. So how do you modify and adapt? So you savor what you've experienced as to how it's uniquely yours and how you can use it. So um, connections are extremely important. The connections that people have with events and people and personalities that they want to relate often shape what their views are. So, listening to a lot of the stories of others is a form of narrative and knowledge that this book, more than a store, offers. Some lessons that might be considered as the reader encounters similar situations. Finally, just to end up, never, never give up. But if and when you're absolutely forced to do so, just pick yourself up and start over with something else using everything you've learned.
Robert, I think that not only is that kind of the hallmark of the book and what readers can take away, but it is also somewhat of a call to action, whether it's retail or whatever industry and sector, because you and I've seen the world
Yep.
change and evolve, but I also recognize that uh, we're also we're both of the same mindset to be contemporary to the current world.
Right.
And what you've done as a mentor to a number of people, I think this is a great opportunity to leverage the book as something that the next generation can look at and realize that, yes, it is going to be bumpy. Yes, it is not going to be perfect. And frankly, no matter how smart you may be, the world throws some twist at you. You know,
Yeah.
uh, it,
As I am fond of saying, if you think you're in control, you're not hearing God laughing.
yes, yes. So, Robert, ways to buy the book currently in Houston. For those who are going to listen to this, are in Houston. There's three bookstores.
Right.
It's eventually going to be on Amazon. That's being worked out. But the
Right.
other is for somebody just to contact you directly.
Absolutely.
You know,
Yep. The book is $40 retail and either at rsakowitz at hazak.com
yeah,
or Brazos Bookstore, Cool Linscomb, or Blue Willow on Memorial. Yeah.
right. And you know, somebody may actually get a signed copy. Listen,
Of course.
I
My
I
pleasure.
have I have greatly again my family owes a lot to the Sakowitz family.
Well,
I
you're
look
nice.
at our generational heritage, like you said, and culture. Some of it may have been mythological, but you and I think discovered some things that we both heard.
Yes.
But Robert, I cannot thank you enough. I believe what you've written and the story that you tell is based, as you and I also talked about. We both realize that we have stood on the shoulders of some really great folks. What our next opportunity is to make sure the next generation, current generation, also has, these lessons. So, Robert, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to do it. I appreciate it very much, and I appreciate the way in which you handle it, Richard.
We'll talk soon. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Be
Thanks.
well.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Okay.